My name is Julian Hale. 10 minutes ago, I stood on the private helipad of the Aura Grande, looking down at a city that now bears my brand, while my mother, Genevieve, sat in my lobby flanked by lawyers and orderlies, her face twisted in a mask of maternal concern. She came here to have me committed to a psychiatric ward so she could seize what she calls my little motel hobby. She has no idea that she isn't in a lobby, she's in my trap. She certainly doesn't know that I'm the one who bought her $50 million in gambling debt last week. But this story doesn't begin in a penthouse. It began 10 years ago in my mother's cold, marble foyer when she looked me in the eye and said something that redefined my entire existence. Before I show you how I turned her psych ward threat into her own financial prison, take a moment to like and subscribe if you believe parents shouldn't treat their children like ATM machines. Now let me take you back to that rainy night in 2016. The probate papers for my grandfather's estate had arrived that morning. He had left me the Shady Pines Motel, a crumbling 30-room relic on a prime piece of coastal land. My mother had already been scouting developers before the body was even cold. That evening, Genevieve called a meeting in the foyer. She was wearing a silk robe and holding a martini, looking more like a shark than a grieving daughter. "We need to discuss the liquidation," she said, tapping her manicured nails against the marble console. "I've already spoken to a developer. We'll flip the motel land for $10 million, I'll clear my credit lines, and you'll get a small stipend to move into a nice apartment downtown." I stood there, clutching the keys my grandfather had personally handed me. "I'm not selling, Mom. I want to fix it up. I have a vision for a boutique brand." Genevieve laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed through the house. "A vision? Julian, be realistic. You're a useless squatter with a sentimentality problem." She stepped closer and what came next felt like ice water in my veins. "You're smart enough to know you can't run a business, but you're too unstable to see it. Keeping that motel is a symptom of a mental breakdown. If you don't sign these papers over to me tonight, I'll have a doctor testify that you're a danger to yourself and your inheritance. You're a liability, Julian. And I don't keep liabilities on my books." I looked at her, then at the 2 luggage bags she'd already packed for me and left by the door. That night I didn't argue. I'd spent my life being the unstable one whenever I disagreed with her spending. Instead, I walked out into the rain and realized something that changed everything. To my mother, I wasn't her son. I just blocked access to her next $10 million. The reading of my grandfather's will didn't take place in a mahogany office with a somber lawyer. It happened in the very foyer where my mother would eventually try to have me committed. Grandpa Silas had always been a man of the earth, his hands calloused from 40 years of running the Shady Pines. He saw the motel as a sanctuary for travelers, but my mother, Genevieve, saw it as a decaying anchor dragging down her social aspirations. When the executor announced that the deed to the property was to pass solely to me, the silence in the room became a vacuum. Genevieve didn't cry for her father. She didn't even blink. She simply set her martini glass down with a clinical click and looked at me as if I were a clerical error she needed to erase. "Julian is barely 20, she told the executor, her voice dripping with a false, practiced concern. "He lacks the emotional stability to manage a lawn, let alone a commercial property. It's a burden he shouldn't have to carry." Before the sun had even set on the day of the funeral, the inheritance war had moved into high gear. I found Genevieve in the kitchen, a stack of glossy brochures spread across the island. They weren't for motel renovations. They were site plans for the Hale Heights luxury condominiums. She had already contacted a demolition crew and a real estate scout. "I've run the numbers," she said, not looking up as I walked in. "The land is worth triple the value of that moldy building. We flip the dirt, I pay off the bridge loan I took for my spring wardrobe, and you get a clean slate. It's a win-win." "I'm not flipping it, Mom," I said, my voice steady despite the roar of blood in my ears. "Grandpa wanted it to stay in a hotel. I have a plan to modernize it." She finally looked at me, and her eyes were as cold as the coastal fog. "Your plan is a fantasy, Julian. You're playing house with a ruin. If you don't sign the power of attorney over to me by Monday, I'll make sure the city inspectors find enough violations to shut you down before you can change a single light bulb." That was the first time she used my mental health as a chess piece, suggesting that my obsession with the motel was a sign of a looming breakdown. She wasn't fighting for my future. She was fighting for the liquidation of my soul to fund her next season of vanity. The war was officially declared, and the battleground was 30 rooms of peeling paint and broken dreams. The Monday deadline arrived not with a conversation, but with a locksmith and 2 men in dark suits standing in the foyer. Genevieve didn't even offer me a seat. She stood at the top of the marble staircase, looking down at me with a mixture of pity and calculated malice. Beside her sat a leather briefcase containing the commitment papers she had threatened me with, the ultimate weapon of a mother who preferred a son in award to a son who stood in the way of her bank account. "You've had 48 hours to regain your senses, Julian," she said, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "But it's clear the stress of your grandfather's passing has triggered a full-blown delusion. You actually believe you can turn a roadside dump into a luxury brand. It's not just a business failure, it's a mental one." I looked at the locksmith as he began to strip the hardware from the front door. My front door. "I'm the legal owner of the motel, Mom. You can't lock me out of the estate just because I won't sell it to fund your lifestyle." "I'm not locking you out of a house," she snapped, her mask finally slipping to reveal the jagged edges of her greed. "I'm removing a liability from my books. Since you're so attached to that ruin, you can live in it. But don't expect a cent from this family until you sign the power of attorney over to someone who is actually competent." She signaled to the men, and before I could reach for my car keys on the console, they had gripped my arms. They didn't hurt me, but the humiliation was a physical weight. They escorted me to the curb where 3 garbage bags held everything I owned, my clothes, a few books, and the framed photo of Grandpa Silas. Genevieve stood in the doorway, the light from the chandelier framing her like a saint, even as she cast me into the dark. "Go play king of your castle, Julian," she called out. "Enjoy the mold and the broken pipes. When the cold finally snaps your delusion, you know where the papers are." The gate clicked shut with a finality that vibrated in my teeth. I stood on the sidewalk, the rain starting to soak through my thin shirt, clutching the rusted keys to the Shady Pines. He thought she was sending me to a grave. She didn't realize she was sending me to my foundation. The Shady Pines Motel was a skeletal remains of a dream when I moved into the manager's office. The air smelled of damp wood and stagnant history, and the wallpaper was peeling in long, jagged strips like dead skin. While Genevieve was busy hosting cocktail parties and telling our social circle that I had vanished into a troubled phase, I was sleeping on a cot and bathing with a garden hose. My inheritance wasn't a gift. It was a grueling, solitary apprenticeship. I started with room 12. It was the only one where the roof didn't leak, and it became my laboratory. I couldn't afford a crew, so I became the crew. I spent my days working at a local construction site to fund my nights of restoration. I learned how to sand floorboards until the oak sang, how to wire lighting that felt like moonlight, and how to plaster walls until they were as smooth as silk. I was obsessed with a specific kind of luxury, not the gold-plated gaudiness my mother craved, but a quiet, tactile excellence. I spent 6 months in that single room. When it was finished, it was a masterpiece of hidden detail. Hand-carved molding, premium linens I'd bought at an auction, and a view of the ocean that I'd framed with reclaimed timber. I listed it online under a pseudonym. Within 48 hours it was booked for a month. The revenue from room 12 funded the transformation of room 11, then room 10. I lived in the shadows of the renovation, a ghost in my own building. I wore tattered work shirts and lived on protein shakes, while the anonymous ghost group I'd registered in Delaware began to garner whispers in travel magazines. Guests would check in, marveling at this secret coastal oasis, never realizing the sweaty man hauling bags of cement behind the service shed was the owner. I wasn't just building a hotel, I was refining a philosophy. Every tile I laid was a rejection of Genevieve's claim that I was a liability. I was building a fortress, one brick at a time, ensuring that by the time she finally looked my way again, I would be untouchable. The transition from a renovated motel to a burgeoning empire happened with the surgical precision of a silent film. By the time I had finished the 20th room at Shady Pines, the ghost group was no longer just a legal shield. It was a ghost story that the hospitality industry couldn't stop whispering about. I operated behind a wall of Delaware LLCs and blind trusts, ensuring that my name never appeared on a single liquor license or building permit. To the world, I was an anonymous investment group. To my mother, I was still the unstable son she assumed was rotting in a coastal squat. I rebranded the property as the first flagship of the Aura collection. The aesthetic was raw, exclusive, and painfully expensive, the exact opposite of the shallow, gold-leafed luxury Genevieve equated with success. As the revenue surged, I didn't buy a Ferrari or a penthouse. I bought debt. Specifically, I targeted the undervalued boutique properties that were failing under the same kind of arrogant, short-sighted management that defined my mother's social circle. I moved like a predator in the dark. While Genevieve was busy trying to maintain her grand dame status by flipping luxury condos, often using predatory bridge loans to cover her overhead, I was quietly acquiring the banks that held those very notes. My life was a montage of blueprints, late-night Zoom calls with offshore lawyers, and the occasional drive-by of my mother's estate in a nondescript sedan. I watched her host extravagant garden parties from a distance, knowing that the very caterers she was bossing around were being paid by a credit line that my holding company now controlled. The Aura collection grew to 5 properties, then 12, then a $700 million international portfolio. I had built a kingdom in the shadows, fueled by the cold clarity that comes from being told you're worth nothing. Every time a new Aura hotel opened to a 5-star review, I felt the tether to my mother's delusion narrative fraying. I wasn't just king of a ruin anymore. I was the architect of a new reality, and the ghost group was about to manifest in the one place Genevieve least expected, her own mailbox. While the Aura collection was quietly reshaping the coast, Genevieve's world was beginning to fray at the edges. Her obsession with status had finally led her into a financial minefield. The Hale Sanctuary, a sprawling, over-leveraged luxury spa that was supposed to be her crowning achievement. She had poured her remaining liquid assets into Italian marble and gold-leafed facial stations, convinced that her name alone would draw the elite. But the market had shifted. The elite were moving toward the authentic, grounded luxury of places like Aura, and by the end of the first year, the sanctuary was a ghost town with a $10 million monthly burn rate. I watched her descent through the clinical lens of a credit report. As her traditional banks began to pull her lines of credit, Genevieve grew desperate. She wasn't used to being told no, and she certainly wasn't used to downsizing. To keep her staff paid and her social standing intact, she began looking for alternative financing. She needed a lender who wouldn't ask too many questions about her dwindling collateral. A lender exactly like Vanguard Equity, a subsidiary of my ghost group. The loan application crossed my desk on a rainy Tuesday, almost 7 years to the day after she had kicked me out. She was offering her personal estate, her jewelry, and even her future inheritance rights as security. She had no idea that the shadowy private equity firm she was praising in her social circles for its discreet partnership was actually her own son. I authorized the loan personally, but I added a series of aggressive cross-collateralization clauses, the kind that legal teams usually flag but desperate socialites ignore. By the time the ink was dry, I didn't just own her debt, I owned her trajectory. I watched as she used my money to buy more champagne and better PR, unaware that every dollar she spent was bringing her closer to the unstable reality she had once predicted for me. She was borrowing her life from me, one high-interest payment at a time. The predator was now the primary stakeholder in her survival, and I was simply waiting for the moment her vanity finally exceeded her credit limit. The discovery happened because of an architectural magazine left in a high-end salon. Genevieve had been flipping through the pages, numbing the anxiety of her mounting debts, when she saw a feature on the Aura collection's 10th anniversary. There, in a blurry background shot of a board meeting, was a man she hadn't seen in a decade. He was wearing a bespoke suit, his posture radiating a quiet, absolute authority that she had spent years trying to crush. The useless squatter hadn't just survived. He had conquered the industry she had spent her life trying to impress. Her reaction wasn't pride. It was a cold, predatory calculation. If Julian was the head of a $700 million empire, then her financial problems weren't just solvable, they were irrelevant. But she knew she couldn't simply ask for a handout. She had burned that bridge with a locksmith and garbage bags 10 years ago. To get her hands on the Aura assets, she needed a legal crowbar. She needed to revive the delusion narrative she had started when he was 20. She spent the next month coordinating with a disgraced psychiatrist and a shady legal team. They drafted a petition for emergency guardianship, citing Julian's sudden and suspicious accumulation of wealth as evidence of a manic episode. The papers painted a picture of a son who was a danger to himself and his family's financial legacy, suggesting that his refusal to contact her for a decade was a symptom of a paranoid break. "I'm doing this for him," she told her lawyer, her voice rehearsed and hollow. "He's clearly in over his head. He needs a mother's guidance to manage such a complex portfolio. It's a tragedy, really." She wasn't just planning a reunion. She was planning a hostile takeover of a human being. She prepared a fraudulent psychiatric commitment order, a document designed to strip Julian of his rights and place the entire Aura collection under her protective control. She had no idea that while she was gathering her papers, I was gathering her promissory notes. She thought she was preparing a cage for a broken son, but she was really just finalizing the inventory for her own bankruptcy. The penthouse of the Aura Grand was a masterpiece of glass and silence, a space designed to make even the most powerful people feel small. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the silver Mercedes pull into the VIP drive far below. Genevieve stepped out, draped in a vintage fur that I knew, from her recent credit statements, hadn't been paid for. She moved with the practiced grace of a woman who still believed she owned the world, flanked by two men in cheap suits and a lawyer carrying a leather briefcase. When the elevator doors hissed open, she didn't come in as a mother. She came in as a conqueror. She didn't look at the art on the walls or the view of the coastline she had once told me I'd never master. She looked directly at me, her eyes wet with a rehearsed, shimmering grief. "Julian," she whispered, her voice trembling with artificial emotion. "Look at what you've done to yourself. This obsession. It's clear you've suffered a total break from reality." She signaled to her lawyer, who slid a thick stack of documents onto my mahogany desk. The header was unmistakable. Petition for involuntary commitment and emergency guardianship. "I'm here to save you, darling," she continued, her tone shifting to that chilling, saccharine sweetness she used when she was at her most dangerous. "The doctors are waiting downstairs. If you sign the voluntary transfer papers now, we can handle this quietly. No scandal for the Aura brand. I'll step in as the conservator, and you can get the rest you so clearly need." I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I watched her hand me a fountain pen, the same one she had used to sign my exile 10 years ago. Behind her, the two orderlies shifted their weight, ready to enforce her mercy. "You really haven't changed, Genevieve," I said, my voice echoing in the vast room. "You still think life is a ledger where you can just delete the parts you don't like. You called me a liability once. You said I was a bad investment. And look at you," she snapped, her mask slipping for a fleeting second. "You've built a cage of glass and ego. You're clearly unstable, Julian. Only a madman would hide like this." I picked up the pen, but I didn't sign. I turned it over in my fingers, watching the light catch the gold nib. "The only madness in this room, Mother, is believing that you are the one in control of this narrative." I pressed a button on my desk and the large monitors on the boardroom wall flickered to life, displaying a series of high-interest promissory notes, all of them bearing her signature and the logo of my holding company. The monitors didn't show family photos or memories. They displayed a cold, digital autopsy of Genevieve Hale's vanity. I watched the blood drain from her face as she looked at the list of creditors. Vanguard Equity, Ghost Group Holdings, and Aura Strategic Partners, the names she had praised at garden parties for saving her lifestyle, were all flashing on the screen, tethered to a single social security number. "You've been very busy, Genevieve," I said, my voice echoing in the vast, silent penthouse. "You borrowed $10 million for the spa. $5 million for the bridge loan on the estate. Another $3 million for the Hale Sanctuary expansion. You even financed that vintage fur you're wearing through a high-interest personal line of credit." Her lawyer stepped forward, his brow furrowed as he scanned the screen. This is impossible. These are independent institutional lenders." "They were," I replied, sliding a final document across the mahogany desk. "It wasn't a commitment form, it was an assignment of debt. But in the last 90 days I've consolidated every single one of your liabilities. I didn't just buy the bank, Mother. I bought you. Every piece of jewelry you own, every brick of the family estate, and every cent of your future earnings are now collateral for a debt that I personally manage." Genevieve's hand shook as she reached for the desk to steady herself. The predatory confidence she had walked in with had evaporated, replaced by the raw, jagged terror of a woman who realized the ground she stood on was no longer hers. "Julian, you can't do this. I'm your mother. And I'm your primary creditor, I said, leaning forward. You came here today to lock me up so you could steal my assets. But the math has changed. You don't have a house to go back to tonight. I foreclosed on the estate at 9 a.m. this morning. You don't have a car downstairs. The lease was terminated an hour ago. You're not here to save an unstable son. You're here because you're insolvent, and you have exactly one person left to beg for mercy. I watched her eyes dart to the orderlies, then back to the debt on the screen. The cage she had built for me was empty and she was the one standing inside it. I wasn't just her son anymore. I was her landlord, her banker, and the sole architect of her remaining days. The silence that followed was heavier than the threat of the psych ward. Genevieve looked at the screen, then at the two men she had brought to kidnap her own son, realizing they were now standing in a room owned by the person they were meant to seize. I picked up the fraudulent commitment papers, the document she had intended to use to erase my life, and held them over the silver trash basin. With a single strike of a match, the pages caught, the edges curling into black ash as the fire consumed her last desperate play. The doctors downstairs can leave, Genevieve, I said, watching the embers die out. There is no one here who needs a guardian. But there is someone here who needs to vacate the premises. I reached into my desk and pulled out a single thin envelope. I didn't slide it across the desk, I dropped it on the floor at her feet. It was a formal notice of eviction for the Hale estate, effective at noon the following day. You spent years calling me a delusion, I continued, stepping around the desk to stand before her. You told the world I was a liability because I wouldn't let you sell my grandfather's soul. Well, the liability has finally been cleared. I've wiped your debts from my books, but I'm also wiping you from my life. You can take your jewelry and your furs, but the house, the name, and the access to my world stay with me. Genevieve reached out, her hand trembling as if to touch my arm, but I stepped back, the distance between us now measured in miles of cold, hard success. She wasn't a mother anymore. She was just a tenant who had failed to meet the terms of her lease. Julian, please. Where am I supposed to go? You're resourceful, Genevieve, I said, echoing the words she'd thrown at me in the rain 10 years ago. I'm sure you'll manage. I signaled to my private security, the real professionals standing by the door, to escort her out. As the elevator doors closed on her stunned, pale face, I felt the final tether snap. The poison was out of my system. I walked back to the window, looking out at the empire I had built in the shadows. For the first time in a decade, the air in the room felt light. I wasn't the king of a ruin or a victim of a narrative. I was simply Julian Hale, and for the first time I was truly home. If this story hit home, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening. See you in the next one.